So watching football yesterday, I guess Sunday, they showed when the Dallas Cowboys opened up the stadium to the general seating area and the stampede that occurred. As thousands of people are trying to go get their best seats. And that's the best comparison I've got right now is we let everybody in from the waiting room here into the big room. This is what it's not AT&T Stadium, and it's not the Dallas Cowboys or the San Francisco 49ers, but we are grateful as you all filter your way in, and thank you for taking some time out this evening. Let's go ahead and get started. Good evening. My name is Brad Lyons. I am the president and publisher of Chalice Press. We are proud to be launching A Time to Mourn and a Time to Dance, a love story of grief, trauma, healing, and faith by Jennifer Ohman-Rodriguez, who we're going to talk with tonight, have a great conversation. Chalice Press is the publishing house of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, but our work extends far beyond serving one denomination. Over the last decade, Chalice Press has released several books that share the stories of when life can be overwhelming and how our faith, our communities, and our own courage can help us emerge from those overwhelming times to live the life that God wants for us. Our books have addressed mental health, suicide, parenting, and grief. It's that last one, grief, that brings us into a community this evening. I'm grateful for all of you who have chosen to spend this winter evening with us, so thank you very much. I'm also honored and thankful to have the opportunity to share our newest book, this honest and heartfelt book, with the world when it launches next week, and I'm grateful to be joined by Jennifer this evening for our conversation. We all experience grief at some point in our lives. That's part of life, and it's out of our control, right? Grief and trauma can linger for years and years, manifesting itself in some unpredictable, sometimes unrecognizable ways. But how we heal and how our faith shapes that healing, that is in our control, right? Jennifer knows this all too well. In her book, she shares her own story of loss, grief, and trauma over the death of her husband, Tony. And then she shares her story of healing and faith. Hearing the stories of others who have faced similar challenges can often be the first step toward healing. And we believe Jennifer's book will serve that purpose for many readers. It's my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Ohman-Rodriguez, a recent graduate, congratulations, of Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, with a Master of Divinity degree. During the height of the pandemic, she served as vicar in a sole pastoral presence to the congregation of St. Andrew Lutheran Church, ELCA, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She is now awaiting her first call in word and sacrament ministry in the ELCA, with the knowledge that her call to ministry includes her continuing to work as a writer. Jennifer's extensive work in faith formation curricula is published by Augsburg Fortress, Spark House, Westminster, John Knox. Her magazine articles and essays have appeared in the Christian Century, Young Children and the Creative Arts, the Lutheran, Gather magazine, and several other publications. She also curates the trauma recovery section of CompassionateChristianity.org. Before her call to ministry, Jennifer worked for 20 years in the early childhood care and education field, teaching in a variety of settings, including childcare, traditional preschool, Head Start, and the college level. Before becoming an educator, Jennifer was a professionally trained musician with a Bachelor of Music degree from the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. In case you're curious, like I was, she was a vocal performance major and a piano minor. That's a different webinar. We'll deal with that one another night. To learn more about Jennifer and her history, please visit chalicepress.com to read her biography. During tonight's conversation, if you have a question for Jennifer, you're invited to type it into the chat feature at the bottom of the screen. I hope to share your questions with Jennifer later in our conversation. Please understand that we're going to respect Jennifer's privacy this evening, so there may be some subjects we can't address, but we thank you for your understanding. So you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to Jennifer. And so Jennifer, I want to thank you for all the work you've done to bring this book to reality. And we're so grateful for this book and for you and your work. And so let's start tonight by having you read a little bit from your book, A Time to Mourn and a Time to Dance.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you for hosting tonight and for publishing my book and for all your support. So I'm going to read a portion of a journal entry. It's in the back of the book, page 168. And this is a part of the book. It's about 14 months into our journey of grief and trauma. Around 14 months. I want to attest to this excruciating, exquisite journey. The moments when all is good, but pain not over yet. And awful, triggering days when time stops once more, falls back into an abyss, one no longer fitting. Today, not hiding in bed as much. Is this progress? Even as guilt revisits me, adding weight to laden soul, prohibiting passage into healing, wondering what I reflect forward to sons, to world, in healing's mirror. Guilt? Hope? Pray my reflection is freedom from despair's exile, from grief and trauma's foreign lands, illuminating possible return to life fully, not former life, but life, carrying inner peace, radiating joy. As the prophet speaks, you will go out in joy, carrying peace.
You will go out in joy carrying peace. Clearly, part of the journey, the end of the journey, if there is one, towards the end. Jennifer, thank you for sharing that with us. This is a memoir, and by definition, that's a life story that looks at the broader picture of how you got to where you were when this story began. And so tell us a little bit, what was life like for you when this story began? Tell us a little bit about your family and what you were doing, where you were, and the kids. That set the stage for us.
Well, spring and summer of 2016 were heady times for us as a family. I had finally decided to answer God's call to ministry. And so I had been busy applying to seminary and writing long essays and doing seminary visits, and then awaiting to hear from the seminaries I had applied to. And I had just been accepted to Luther Seminary along with another seminarian. And so these were times of a lot of conversation between Tony and I, conversations about how we were going to do this. And I remember one time Tony just looking at me, and he got this wild look in his eye, and he said, "How are we going to pay for this?" And I said, "Don't worry, I'm a former fundraiser. I'll figure it out." So that was part of what was going on. The other big issue going on was that our oldest son was very sick, and we just didn't know what it was. And we were going to doctor after doctor after doctor, and just a frustrating situation. As anyone who is listening knows, when you have a medical mystery, it is extremely frustrating. And that's what this was. And we were able to have him finally get a good diagnosis, which was Lyme disease. But then when you're diagnosed with Lyme disease, part of the next question is, well, how long do you think the person has had it? Because that makes a big difference in the future. So that's where we were. Just a lot going on.
Yeah, a time of uncertainty. How do you pay for this on the upside? How do you deal with a child's illness on the flip side? So
Right.
I'm sure that's carrying concern, that's carrying a bit of grief, and that there may be grief lurking out around there. And so, like I said in the intro, grief is always with us,
Right.
whether we see it or not, and it may not be tangible yet. So what was your job at that point? You said you were answering the call to ministry, but what was a typical day for you back then?
Well, part of this is I had just put everything on hold because my oldest son was sick.
Yeah.
So I was still doing some writing. I had been writing professionally. I can't even tell you if I had any jobs, freelance writing jobs then. I have no memory of that.
Mhm.
I had stopped doing early care and education consulting work, but I was really just trying to maintain some sort of semblance of stability in our
Mhm.
home. And
Mhm.
at this point in Tony's clinical practice, we could financially do that, but that was fairly new for us.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
so that's where things were.
All right. So Jennifer has written about the hard part of this story, right? And we're not going to go into that part this evening, but Jennifer has shared the story of Tony's passing in the book. And so I encourage you to go read that at your convenience and take some time to soak that all in. But that's the pivot point of this whole story. But Jennifer's, we're not focusing on that in this book. It's the after on all that. And so in the reading that she gave a moment ago, she hinted at the despair and the darkness and whatnot. But Jennifer, you've been working on this book for quite some time. You've been with us with Chalice Press for more than a year now. So tell us a little bit about how this book came to be as you emerged, worked your way out of that chaos.
Well, actually, the book is actually born in the chaos. In the aftermath, at some point, I started journaling again. I've always been a journaler, but I started just writing little snippets down because everything was so intense. Everything felt intense and felt in slow motion, which is typical of a trauma response, that life slows into slow motion. And so I just started writing in my journal, and it'd be one sentence here or a fragment, often in fragments, over here. And I was starting to do this more and more and more. And so this is very early on. Tony died in August of 2016, and I'm journaling in late September already. And I just kept journaling and journaling and journaling. And then, about 5 months after Tony died, I was standing in the high school gym. Actually, it wasn't the gym, it was the cafeteria. And I was there for conferences, student teacher conferences. And my younger son was not doing well. I mean, this had been a horrendous fall for him. And I could barely stand in this cafeteria. That I'd actually driven there and I was standing in the middle of all these people and all this noise. That was a huge thing for me to have accomplished, but I couldn't seem to figure out, because my brain is so offline. I can't figure out where to start in his schedule because I'm pretty sure every teacher is going to say the same thing to me. And I'm standing there, I'm lost. And another writer and a publisher I know walked right up to me and he said, "You need to write about this."
Mm.
He didn't even say hello. He just went writer to writer, "You need to write about this." And I'm like, I can't. Well, that's not true. I was. But I hadn't put it together that I might need to write and have it public. So that's how it all began. So it's quite an early process. So now at this point, it's almost 5.5 years since that started.
Yeah.
To this point.
I'm going to say about 5 years ago, you were standing in that gymnasium.
Yep.
Which is an overwhelming feeling for a lot of folks anyway. Just parent-teacher conference nights can be bad. But yeah, when you're in a situation where your brain's not processing and you're, to put words in your mouth, or you're kind of dreading the experience,
Right.
those little things can feel like climbing Mount Everest.
Yes, it definitely did. Walking from my car into the cafeteria, I was just glad I'd done that.
Yeah.
That was a big deal. Or that I'd gotten to the high school without kind of having a little fender bender, because I kept having fender benders during this time. And my older son and I started calling them grief dents, because he was denting his car and I was denting mine.
So did you go home that night and start writing, or how did you process that?
I did go home and start writing. I almost got flooded with words, which is an experience I've often had as a writer. Like there's just these very Holy Spirit moments where it's just coming, and I just have to get it down some way on paper or on the computer. And so yeah, there was a deluge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And off you went. Yeah. At
Yeah.
some point, I need for you to send me that other publisher's name and address so I can send a thank you note.
Oh, I will do that.
But I think that points to a larger issue, and it's that writers work in community, but we process grief and loss in community, and we've seen it particularly over the last 2 years with the pandemic, when we've all been sequestered in our own homes and we've not had the chance, most of us, to go to the funeral that we really felt compelled to go to, or to be able to go do the things to memorialize others or honor others. And we just not been able to do those things. And so I think the last 2 years have brought a new sense of grief in a variety of different forms that none of us ever anticipated we'd be dealing with in the first place. As we pass 800,000 fatalities from COVID in the not too distant past, plus the fact that life just continues and life ends, we have all of these different memorial services, and we hold them in our own houses because we can't go anywhere else to do it. And I would like to think that perhaps this book is one way that we're going to be able to find some common threads, some common connections as we grieve what we've lost and not been able to grieve properly over the last couple of years. So and again, I'm a publisher, I'm not a therapist. So, correct me if I'm wrong, Jennifer. I mean, what does your background say on this?
So, and I'm not a therapist either. Tony was.
Right.
But I do have a background in human services. But I would like to say this time in the pandemic there's a layer of grief, because we're all grieving what we haven't been able to do and the people we haven't been able to see or see enough of. But also there's a layer of trauma. There's a low level of trauma all the time, because especially in the beginning of the pandemic, this was life and death, right? We didn't know what was going to happen if we caught COVID, right? We didn't know if we would get to the other end of it. And many people didn't. 800,000 people, you just quoted that statistic. So once there's a life or death situation at play in our lives, our bodies, without our permission, without our control, will start to gear up to save us. God has created us very well to keep us alive. And so our bodies start into something called fight or flight or freeze, right? So this pandemic has really lent itself to people going into like low-level freezing, especially when we've been sequestered in our homes or we can't go out as much, things like that. So there's been both things happening during these last few years for everyone. And regardless if a person thinks they're experiencing low-level trauma, and because many people don't know how to know that they're experiencing that, but this is what we are seeing play out in the world, is the response of this low-level trauma that we're not dealing with.
Right. I think back to my high school and college psychology courses, and it always seemed to be looking outward at others. Well, this is what I see in this person or that person. And I really wish they were taught differently so that we could help recognize those pressure points in ourselves, because it's so easy to miss when we're stressed out and when we're under such duress like we've been for such a long time. How do we deal with that? And man, my back is sore and I don't know why. Well, guess what? You've been in trauma for a long time. You've been stressed. Things are hard. Life is hard. One of the things that the Chalice books we've been working on, the ones that I mentioned earlier on, is talking about mental health and understanding that it is a natural process. This is how we are built, and understanding that we need to learn to be able to understand that sometimes we need some help, whether that's talking to the right person, reading the right book, or getting the right medicine. And I've seen that firsthand in my life in the not too distant past, and what a difference medication can make. But in this book, you're stressing on how do we process that, and so what is your take on if someone's sensing that they're experiencing trauma that's bordering on debilitating? What's your suggestions for them? How do they deal with that?
Well, I think first of all, if a person is sensing something, it's actually just naming what they're sensing. Like you just said, my back hurts, right? Or my ankle hurts, or my stomach's upset a lot, or something in the body. Just identifying what's going on in our bodies, because we have a huge way especially in the Western way of thinking, of separating our heads from our bodies, our minds from our bodies. Well, they're not separate, right? There's this neck thing that connects us. And in that neck is this huge amount of nerves, right? That are running all through our body. And that's a whole nother talk probably, but we're not separated from our bodies, and our bodies are always communicating to us. So after Tony died, I felt like I had a huge ball or oval in my stomach. And I had that ball or oval in my stomach for at least 9 months, right? And I could hardly eat because my stomach was full of this thing, right? That wasn't really there. Like if we'd done an MRI or an X-ray, there wouldn't have been something there. But I had this sensation there. And because I had the sensation, I couldn't eat. And I did lose too much weight during that time. But my body was telling me something. And so I took that information to my therapist. I'm like, there's this thing, in my, and that's where I did so much what's called EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization processing. And that is one of the many trauma modalities that you can use when you've experienced either one-time trauma or ongoing or long-term. So I would say to anyone, start talking to your body, whatever that means to you. Start identifying what's happening in your body, and then make a phone call or do something online and try to find a therapist. And I know that's difficult right now. There are long waiting periods, but I always say, a waiting list, that waiting list isn't written in stone. Waiting lists change, and sometimes you just don't know when an opening's going to be. So the best thing to do if you feel like you're experiencing depression, anxiety, trauma-related symptoms is to get in and see a therapist.
Yeah.
And start there.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'll acknowledge again, you're a writer and not a therapist, so please seek professional help on these kinds of things when you need it. It's well worth the effort and the investment. But thank you, Jennifer, for that insight. Let's get back to the subject of writing. So once you kind of got churning on this book, what was the hardest part about writing this book for you?
Well, I was in seminary at the same time. Dare I say my seminary papers were got in the way sometimes, or I can say that now that I've graduated. But I think this type of writing, this more raw, very emotionally deep writing, takes a lot of time. And by time, I don't mean time on task. I don't mean time writing, but I mean a lot of stepping away. And so one of the things I've learned throughout writing this book is how to step away, because I can't see the writing. I can't feel the writing and the words unless I give it a break. So I would work on a section a chapter, and then I would try to set it aside for 24 hours, 48, or even up to a week, and then come back, because then I was fresh, right? Then I'm fresh, and I can see it, and I can see where it doesn't quite make sense, because now I haven't just written it. I've sort of forgot that I wrote these words.
Yeah.
So that was something I really was learning while I was writing this book, is how to set the writing aside.
Did you have a daily routine to write, or was it okay?
Yeah, my literary agent is on here, and she's probably smiling and laughing right now because she knows my routine. But like, I'm an early morning writer. I get up and I journal first, and then I hit the whatever I'm working on, and so I'm probably done writing by 8:30 in the morning, but I've written for 3 hours.
Goodness. How much coffee do you drink?
Don't drink coffee anymore. I do drink tea.
Okay.
That's 2 to 2.5 cups.
Okay. So we have a morning author who doesn't drink coffee. I can't explain this. I can't even type an email subject line without a cup of coffee. I appreciate that. Yeah, that routine is so important though. And I imagine that kind of had that rhythm to it. Did that give it an extra kind of life that needed to happen? Was that breathing life into the project to have that kind of daily routine?
I think that daily routine just saved me,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm still healing during this.
Sure.
I'm still in the throes of major trauma reaction and recovery. And that was just time the house was quiet, and I could just be in this story that we were living, which also meant I could sob, right? And I could smile and laugh, and I could just feel all what I needed to feel for my own healing.
Mm-hmm.
So always my own healing and my children's healing were primary. The book was always secondary.
Sure.
Writing was always secondary.
Yeah, but probably a sense that they were coupled though, right? That the
Right.
book supported the primary goal.
Right.
Good.
Right. And it just kept me close. So Tony died suddenly, and anyone who's experienced the sudden death of a beloved knows you don't get to say goodbye. You don't get anything. You don't get any planning time. You don't know what they want for their funeral. But this writing the book kept me closer to him for the time I needed.
Good. So that may really be leading to the next question, which was what was the most liberating thing about writing this book for you?
Well, Brad, the most liberating thing was when you offered a contract.
I promise I did not know that was the answer when I asked the question.
Well, as a writer, that was one of the most liberating thing, because once you have a book contract or a book come out, things change for us professionally in a good way. So that's been very liberating for me professionally. Emotionally, the whole process of writing is just helps me make sense of my life, and I really need that. It's just something I need daily. I need to process what's going on with me emotionally, what's gone on in the past, what's happening in the present. I need to process it, and I need to process it with a pencil and a piece of paper.
Yeah. So I said at the beginning, if you had a question for Jennifer, to put it into the chat, and we've got a couple over there. So I will turn over to that right now. Stephen has asked, when you were in slow motion during that first year, did you find that your spiritual life and practices were also thrown into slow motion? Does disassociation, at least in your experience, cause us to experience weakened associations and connections with the divine? Simple little question, big subject.
Oh, it's an excellent question. Yes and yes. Okay, so it's really typical, normal. in the aftermath of trauma to not have a connection to anyone, anything, right? We feel very disconnected. The process of healing is a process of reconnecting us to other human beings and to our spiritual belief systems. So no, I didn't feel God at all. I didn't know where God was. I mean, that comes out in my journaling, that I still have this very active faith. And thank God I was journaling, because if I looked back on it now, I'd say, oh, no, I didn't feel God at all. I know in my journaling that I was in this relationship with God, and I was dependent on God, and I knew all sorts of things, but my experience, my emotional experience, which are always primary to us as human beings, was non-existent. But then I couldn't feel that I couldn't feel my love for Tony. I couldn't feel love for some of my family members. I was void. I almost felt void of feeling in general. So the other part of that question was on spiritual practices.
Right.
A lot of my prayers are in the book that I was praying. But I also, like, I didn't worship with a community for months. I couldn't walk into my congregation. I just could not do that. And the first time I did, my mother came and went with me. And I think I grabbed onto her. I think I was like grabbing onto her very tightly at some point, because I just didn't know how to be there. And then
This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, and we're being recorded.
All
So yeah, so the other part of that is I couldn't sing or pray communally. So I had to I allowed the congregation to sing for me and pray for me in community worship.
That must be an odd feeling for a seminarian, to feel so disconnected from the divine.
Yeah, I wasn't too concerned about it, actually. I mean, I really was not doing well. So like, I just thought, well, I'll figure this out.
Yeah. So was there a moment when you realized, okay, God and I are reconnecting here? Do you remember that feeling coming back? Was it a snap of the fingers? Was it something slow? How did that transpire?
Well, I think over time and with healing, and here's where seminary was great, is that I had no choice but to be reading scripture. This was required of me. And I did something I still think is a really smart thing. I took most of my Old Testament classes first. And the Old Testament is just full of lament. And so I really loved hanging out with Job. And I loved hanging out with the psalmists and with the prophets. Like, they all made sense to me. And so that's kind of part of my journey of reconnecting with the divine and with worship.
So Angie has asked, she says that the title, A Time to Mourn and A Time to Dance, is deeply moving. Was there any inspiration behind the time to dance part? And were there any memories of this feeling during your grieving or during writing? So do you want to share how we landed on that title?
Well, how do we say this, Brad? So the title is a collaborative effort between the publishing house and the author. And I couldn't land on a title myself. I didn't know what to call this book. I think I sent you, Brad, like 10 different title options. I just couldn't figure it out. And then you came up with this, I think.
We recognize the text from almost said Lamentations, Ecclesiastes. For everything there is a season. And so we dug into that scripture, and that's when we came up with A Time to Mourn and A Time to Dance. And we recognized that there was that journey just in that one line of scripture. And so that's where this title is drawn from. And we've all heard that song by the Byrds from the 60s, and we've seen it elsewhere. But that's where that scripture is. That's the only book title I've ever pulled directly out of scripture. And I cannot think of a better place for it than this book. So let's go back to the time to dance part. So Angie asked, was there any times that you felt times to dance during the grieving or during the writing?
Yes. So I think most writers have to move at some point in their, if we're intensely writing. And so I don't remember dancing early on at all, especially that first year. I do in the revisions, the multiple revisions of this book, I danced a lot, but I was also more healed. But in the early days, it's really certain music, and I write about that in the book. There's certain music that's pulling me in, and I do that that thing we do often when we're hurting is I latched on to certain pieces, and then I played them over and over and over and over and over again. Mm-hmm. And those pieces still, those songs, if I played one of them right now, I would be in tears. Mm-hmm. Absolutely in tears.
Yeah. Music does have that connection. It's amazing how something so simple can anchor so deeply in our souls at times. So Jan has asked something that can be related to worship and the different ways we worship. What aspects of worship continued to connect with you through these years? And what does worship do best to include for people? What does worship do best to include for people working through trauma, whether they know it or not?
Well, that's a difficult question, especially in the last couple of years where worship can look like this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've done a lot of worships on Zoom. And that's difficult in the grieving and trauma recovery process. That's my sense of it. Because there's something about the human connection that, people to people, face to face, which settles us. Something called mirror neurons that we all possess, where we can get some of that on Zoom. They have actually done some research on this, but we don't get, there's just something about in-person worship. Mm-hmm. I think the thing that I would say to worship leaders is that just as there's a time to mourn and a time to dance, there's a time for quiet in worship, and there's a time for loud, exuberant joy, and there's a time to lament, and there's a time to praise loudly. I think we have to just know we can't be everything for everybody because we don't know what people need at what times, but we can provide worship that isn't on one end or the other. So it's very popular to have what's in the field called happy clappy worship. That if you talk to a griever, they don't want anything to do with it. It's too happy. So things like Blue Christmas services, or just having healing services of healing on a regular basis, which we have in our ELCA hymnal, things like that. So we're not always just happy, and we're not always just sad, but that we bring it all in to worship. And however a community decides to do that is what fits for them.
So thinking about some of the most public displays of grief that we see. So for instance, after 9/11, when we had national and community-based worship services. I was in Oklahoma City when the federal bombing was destroyed, and Billy Graham and Bill Clinton and others came to Oklahoma City that Sunday to do a memorial service. And I remember it struck me at the time as, yeah, I don't have the energy for that. I'm exhausted. I was a journalist and I had covered the bombing, but in retrospect, I can see how that community grieving makes a difference, and how that opportunity, whether you're there in the arena or the sanctuary or the park or wherever, it makes a difference. And it gives you that community to know that you're not alone. You're not the only person who's torn up about this. And so, I see these pastors who are organizing vigils on an hour's notice when something horrific happens in their town. And I can't help but think how incredibly challenging that is, and how incredibly undervalued that kind of service to your community is. It's just amazing to think about how quickly those things can be pulled together and how important they can be. Yes. Whether that's a worship service or a vigil or just gathering in silence at a particular place. So, yeah.
And we don't do silence well in worship. Yeah. Like, there are communities that do. And if you talk to them, they've worked at it. They started with 1 minute, and then they went to 2, then 3, 4, 5. They've worked up to being silent together. And there is something very powerful, especially for those people seeking healing, to sit with other people in silence. Mm-hmm.
So this is an opportunity to look at one of the practices that you shared in the book. And so, Jennifer, I'm going to ask you to open up to the back of the book, the practice you identified a little while ago, and walk us through that. Have a chance to kind of catch our breath in this intense conversation.
Okay. So in the book, there are both prayers, and they're very simple practices. And this one's on page 142 at the bottom, just called Healing Practice. And so I want you to start being conscious of your breathing in and breathing out. And do that a couple of times. Breathe in and breathe out. And this time, as you breathe in, I want you to breathe in, and in your mind, name some goodnesses in your life that you are breathing in. So for me, I still have my Christmas tree up, and it's right next to me right here. So to me, that's a goodness. It brings me joy. So I'm going to breathe in, thinking and being thankful for this Christmas tree, and that I didn't have to cook dinner, and that it was a really balmy day here in Iowa. And now as I let my breath out, I'm going to breathe out the yucky things in my life right now. Whatever those are for you, breathe those out. So maybe that's the pandemic. Maybe you've lost a loved one. Maybe you've lost a beloved pet. Maybe you just feel without hope today. Just breathe that out. And that's the practice. You can do that as many times as you want. Breathe in goodness or your goodnesses, and breathe out your yucky stuff. And as I say in the book, you let that yucky stuff float out on the carbon monoxide. Let the good stuff come in on the oxygen, and the yucky stuff on the carbon monoxide.
I hate to interrupt this moment.
Okay.
But now we all have a takeaway to remember. It's simple. You can do it anywhere. You can do it without anybody noticing. So remember that the next time you're in a staff meeting that's frustrating. But I appreciate that opportunity to reflect and just pause. We don't get to pause very often, do we? We go so fast. So so let's back to the book, back to the writing. So when you share your story, what are some of the more surprising things that you're hearing folks feedback to you? What has surprised you or caught you off guard about what you've written or what you have to say about grief?
One of the things that's caught me off guard is that I've had so many people tell me they've read the book in one sitting. They just sit down and read, and they'll notice it's 1 a.m. or 3 a.m. I mean, this has happened a number of times. That's surprising to me because I cannot read the book in one sitting. I can't. I have to, even in revisions, I had to do small chunks of it at a time because it is so deeply personal to me. So that's been very surprising to me. The other surprising thing I've heard back from people is how many people are looking for a therapist, and that's beautiful. That's amazing to me.
Good. Well, I think it's an indicator of how our culture is changing and understanding the value of mental health and how we adjust it. It's not just on ourselves anymore.
Right.
So,
Right.
earlier in the Q&A, Laura asked me, I didn't know I was going to be asked questions tonight. What was it about this manuscript that made me say yes? And so I can couple that with something that Kate wrote a little further down. And what Kate wrote was, in some parts of the book, Jennifer writes in a style that might be called the dialect of trauma, choppy and truncated sentences that flow in an almost childlike rhythm. So Kate answered my question from Laura. As we read this manuscript, and what we saw was a writing style that was unique to anything we had done. The authenticity with which it was written, there was no icing, no glaze put on this. We could see straight down to what was going on, but it was just so beautifully written, even in its draft forms that was being passed around. And so the authenticity of it was really what resonated so strongly with us. We knew that grief was already out there as a subject that needed to be addressed. And we brought this book under contract in 2020. So we had already seen grief beginning to play itself out in society, but goodness, we thought it was almost over, didn't we? But we recognized that a book on grief coupled with a take on grief from a faith perspective was right down our alley. So that's how we ended up with bringing this book under contract. The rest of what Kate has to ask is, she wonders if Jennifer's background in early childhood development gives you access to the dialect you've created in writing this and your ability to meet people where they are.
Yes, it does. That's something we're taught in early care and education and early child development, is that we start with what's in front of us, the person in front of us, whether that's a 3-year-old or their 25-year-old parent, or we start where these people are, not where we think they should be or where the culture thinks they should be. So yes, very much so. I'm very my time and my education, my experience in early care and education is all through this book. Even the documenting, in journaling, I'm really documenting what's happening, and that's very Piagetian of me. Jean Piaget was an early child development researcher, and we still refer to him when we are learning about children. So yeah, that's woven throughout the book.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So if you want to drop something into the Q&A, oh, there we go. Cassie just dropped in one right as if on cue. She says, I particularly enjoyed the moments you dedicate to offering healing practices and the journal prompts. At what point in your writing process did you decide to provide these offerings to the reader?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Some of the prayers were happening. They were happening. I was writing those. Those were part of my journaling. Um, but really, the practices came into play when I met my literary agent, Kate Sheehan Roche. Um, and she was picking out parts of my journaling that had practiced. She identified that had practices in these journal entries that I hadn't even known were there. So she brings that into my consciousness, and that's where they start.
And what that was another thing that attracted us to this was those practices. One of the things that Chalice Press looks for in books is books that have useful takeaways, useful carryaways. So many books are great reads and then they're done. But one of the things that Jennifer did that many of our other authors do was those questions, those experiential things, the ways to reflect on what you just read and ponder them in new and different ways. And so we were grateful to see that. That caught our attention as well. So, so what are you working on? He said, knowing the answer and how that's related to what we were just talking about.
I am working on a book of meditations for people in trauma recovery. And those meditations include small amounts of Holy Scripture with reflection, spiritual practice, and prayer. So that's, I have more reflections than anyone will want in one book. So I think I counted 80 the other day. So that's
80? Nice.
80. Yeah.
All right then. Good.
Yeah.
Well, Gail has asked, going back to the Q&A, Gail has asked, do you promote the remembering of the anniversary of losses?
I think this is very individual. I think many of us don't have a choice in remembering. Like there's something about the days before or the day of or the days after in which it's just there. It's just there. So I think that what I would support people in doing is just allowing what happens to happen. Therapists will call these anniversary issues. That's actually a term. They're ever present for me, I will say. 5 anniversaries in.
Mm-hmm.
I just know. I know the day, I know the time.
Mm-hmm.
I know. And my therapist would say the body knows.
Mm-hmm.
So I think once again, I would promote trusting our bodies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it also sounds as though it's the kind of thing that can't be denied or cover up. You know it's there. Why run from it? Celebrate what you had. Celebrate that life, and mourn that loss, but be grateful for the experience. Is that too saccharine an approach to that? Am I laying it on too thick?
Well, maybe for me, you are.
Okay,
I don't
that's
know
fair.
for other
That's
people.
fair.
I don't know for other people. I think we need to do what we need to do during that time.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've lost your spouse and you need to make their favorite cake on their birthday, then make it. Whatever it is you need to do or not do. And if you don't need to do anything, I would just say, I hope you don't feel guilty because it's okay. How we grieve and how we grieve throughout our lives, it's very individual.
Yeah.
So just know that.
Well, as we wrap up, I just want to acknowledge that this book, which launches next Tuesday, is probably the second most exciting thing that has happened to you this month. What was the first most exciting thing that happened to you this month?
In January or the
Yeah.
end of December, Brad?
Oh, was it the end of December? I saw the Facebook post in January.
Well, yes. So in part of my healing process, I have remarried, and in the end of December.
I see applause all over the place. Well, congratulations, and we're grateful for that continuation of the story, and evidence of how God works in weird ways. Am I right?
Yes. Yes.
But
especially since we met at church.
well, now,
Yeah.
I think that's a good note to end on. So as we wrap up, I just want to remind you, if you don't already have your copy of A Time to Mourn and A Time to Dance, you can order it from chalicepress.com. You can order it from any other place that you order books, but when you order from Chalice Press, it literally means twice as much to our publishing house and to Jennifer. So we encourage you to buy a copy for yourself or buy a copy for someone who you think could be helped by what Jennifer has to share. But above all, be there for those who need you. And we're grateful for, I think, for that message, and take care of yourselves. And like Jennifer said, do what you need to do. Jennifer, any last thoughts tonight?
Many thanks for everyone who has come out tonight on Zoom for this, and for buying the book or reading it and giving it to other people. Thank you so much for all this support. I really appreciate it.
And we appreciate you, Jennifer. Thank you so much. So we're coming up on 8 o'clock this evening, at least here in the Central Time Zone. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I hope it's been a good use of your time. We appreciate it. Thank you all for being here, and have a good evening and rest of the week. Take care.